Chapter 1. They say love is blind, and for 8 years, I lived proof of it. I was Kathleen Morgan, daughter of a successful businessman, accustomed to the comforts of life. But none of that mattered when I met Carter Hayes. He was the boy with messy hair and worn-out sneakers, sitting in the corner of the university library, buried in his books. There was something magnetic about him, his quiet determination, the way he seemed to carry the weight of the world but refused to falter. "Excuse me, are you using this?" I asked, pointing to a financial report lying on the desk. He glanced up, startled, then shook his head. "No, go ahead." His voice was steady but tired, and his eyes darted back to his notebook filled with meticulous notes. Over time, I learned those late nights at the library were his only respite from working 2 part-time jobs to pay for tuition. Carter had dreams, big ones. He wanted to start his own business, to escape the cycle of poverty he'd grown up in. I admired that. My world had been one of privilege, but his was a fight for survival. And somewhere along the way, admiration turned into love. 8 years, I whispered to myself, sitting on the edge of the bed in the apartment we now shared. The place was modest, nothing like the sprawling family estate I'd grown up in. But I'd never minded. I believed in Carter's vision, his passion, and his promise to build a future for us. Our relationship wasn't perfect. The early days were a whirlwind of supporting him, helping with his assignments, covering small expenses when his paychecks ran short. But it was worth it. When he proposed 2 years ago, sliding a simple gold band onto my finger, I thought it was the beginning of forever. Yet, here I was, 2 years into an engagement that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. "Morning," Carter's voice broke my thoughts. He leaned against the doorframe, shirt unbuttoned, his hair still damp from the shower. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. He walked over, pressing a quick kiss to my cheek. "I'll be late tonight. There's a dinner with some investors." "Investors?" Another excuse. "Should I come with you?" I asked, knowing the answer. Carter paused, his expression unreadable. "It's just business. No need to tire yourself out." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. He always had a reason to leave me behind. And lately, there was always someone else by his side, Aria. Aria Sinclair entered our lives a year and a half ago, fresh from her studies abroad. She was Carter's childhood friend, a fact he never failed to remind me of. "We grew up together," he'd said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "She's like a sister to me." But sisters didn't occupy the space Aria did in his life. From the moment she joined Carter's company as his secretary, things began to shift. He started spending more time at the office, and when he wasn't there, he was with Aria, helping her settle into her new apartment, which, as it turned out, was one of the properties he owned. She lost her parents, Kath, Carter had explained when I questioned it. "She doesn't have anyone else." What was I supposed to do? "Maybe not treat her like she's more important than your fiancé," I'd snapped, regretting it instantly. He'd sighed, a long, weary sound that felt like a dagger. "You're being unreasonable. She's family. Why can't you understand that?" Chapter 2. Aria wasn't just a shadow in our lives, she was a storm. The way she occupied Carter's attention, his time, and even his affection left me feeling like a stranger in my own relationship. "Did you see this?" my best friend, Elena, said one evening, holding up her phone. I was curled up on the couch, trying to distract myself with a book. "What?" I asked, though I already knew it wouldn't be good. "She posted it this morning." Elena handed me her phone. On the screen was Aria's latest social media post, a picture of her holding a glittering bracelet, with the caption, "When your best friend knows exactly what you like." "Thank you, Carter." I felt the familiar sting of anger and humiliation. Carter had once bought me a bracelet like that for my birthday. It had been years ago, but now, he couldn't even remember to pick up flowers for me. "That's the 3rd post this week," Elena muttered. "First the dinner, then the office selfie, and now this." Are you seriously just going to let her do this? What am I supposed to do? I snapped, more frustrated with myself than her. She's his secretary. And according to him, she's just a friend. If I say anything, I'm the jealous fiancé who can't understand their bond. Elena frowned. That's not a bond, Kath. That's her staking a claim. That evening, Carter came home late, as usual. I was sitting at the dining table, nursing a cup of cold tea. "You're still up?" he asked, setting his keys down on the counter. I took a deep breath, deciding to confront him. "Carter, we need to talk." He glanced at me, his expression cautious. "About what?" "Arya," I said bluntly. "What about her?" His tone was defensive, as if he'd been expecting this. "She's overstepping, Carter. The gifts, the constant posts about you." "She's just being friendly," he interrupted, shaking his head. "Why are you making this into something it's not?" "Because it feels like I don't matter anymore." I exploded, standing up. "She calls, and you drop everything. She gets gifts and attention, and I get nothing. Do you even realize how that makes me feel?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Kathleen, you're overthinking this. You've had everything handed to you your whole life. Arya hasn't. She's had it hard, and I'm just trying to help her." "By putting her above me?" My voice cracked, but I refused to let the tears fall. "She's like a sister to me," he said firmly, as if that explanation was supposed to erase everything. "But sisters didn't live in your properties. They didn't accompany you to business dinners meant for partners. And they certainly didn't post pictures with captions that felt like daggers aimed at your fiancé." The breaking point came on a stormy night. I had a fever, my head pounding and my body aching. Carter had promised to be home early, so I didn't bother calling anyone else. But he didn't come. Hours passed, and the fever worsened. Finally, I called him. "Hello?" he answered, his voice muffled by background noise. "Carter," I rasped, struggling to speak. "I'm really sick. Can you come home?" There was a pause, followed by a hesitant, "I can't right now, Kath." "Arya." "Arya?" My voice rose, despite the pain in my throat. "She cut her finger on some papers, and called me crying. She's terrified of the storm, and I couldn't just leave her alone." I hung up. 2 days later, I learned from my mother and brother that Carter hadn't come home until after the storm had passed. It was Christopher, my childhood friend, who brought my mother and brother to check on me. They found me barely conscious, burning with fever. It was Christopher who bought my medication, stayed by my side, and held my hand until the fever broke. And it was Carter who brushed it off when he finally returned. "You had your family with you," he said. "Arya needed me." Chapter 3. Arya's provocations only grew bolder. She posted pictures of extravagant dinners Carter took her to, claiming they were business meetings. One post showed a necklace I recognized as a limited edition piece from a boutique Carter and I used to frequent. "I guess this is just part of their sibling dynamic," I muttered bitterly to Elena, showing her the post. "She's mocking you," Elena said, her tone sharp. "How can Carter not see it?" The answer was simple: he didn't want to see it. Every time I brought up my concerns, Carter dismissed them with the same tired excuses. "She's just a friend, or worse, you're being unreasonable." One evening, I decided to confront Arya directly. She was at the office late, as usual, and I arrived unannounced. "Arya," I said, stepping into her space. She looked up from her laptop, a hint of surprise on her face before it melted into her usual smug expression. "Kathleen," she said sweetly, feigning innocence. "What brings you here?" "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm. "About Carter." Her eyes widened in mock surprise. "Carter? What about him?" "Stop playing games," I snapped. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. The gifts, the trips, the constant need for his attention." "Carter and I are close," she interrupted, her tone saccharine. But it's purely platonic. He thinks of me as a sister. Surely you can't be jealous of that. You're deliberately driving a wedge between us, I said. And I won't stand for it. Arya leaned back in her chair, her smile sharpening. If Carter's drifting away from you, Kathleen, maybe you should look in the mirror instead of blaming me. Her words stung, but I refused to let her see it. Chapter 4. A few weeks later, a message from an unknown number changed everything. It was a video. My heart raced as I clicked play, dreading what I might see. There they were, Carter and Arya, kissing at what appeared to be a company party. The room was dimly lit, the atmosphere charged. They didn't look like siblings. They looked like lovers. Another video followed. This one showed them entering a hotel together, their movements unsteady, as if they were drunk. I couldn't breathe. My hand shook as I dropped the phone. When Carter came home that night, I confronted him. "Who sent you that?" he asked, his face pale. "Does it matter?" I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "I saw the videos, Carter. You and Arya, how could you?" "It wasn't what it looked like," he stammered, his excuses as pathetic as they were predictable. "We were drunk. It was a mistake. Nothing happened at the hotel." "You're lying," I cut him off, my voice trembling. "You've been lying for months." "Look, you'll calm down and realize you're overreacting," he said dismissively, his arrogance infuriating. "You always come back, Kathleen. You need me." Chapter 5. The next morning, I packed my bags and left. My parents and brother welcomed me back without hesitation, and Christopher was there, as always, offering his quiet support. "I knew he wasn't good enough for you," Christopher said one evening as we sat on the porch. "I should have listened," I admitted, my voice heavy with regret. "But I loved him, Chris. I gave him everything." "And he didn't deserve it," Christopher said firmly. "But you're stronger than this, Kath. You're not alone." His words were a balm to my wounded heart. Over the following weeks, Christopher became my rock. He listened without judgment, made me laugh when I thought I'd forgotten how, and reminded me of the person I used to be before Carter broke me. As Carter continued to parade Arya around, oblivious to the storm brewing, my family and Christopher worked behind the scenes to dismantle his empire. I sold my shares to Christopher in secret, knowing he would handle the rest. My father and brother leveraged their connections to withdraw investments and spread whispers about Carter's untrustworthiness. Carter didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. His company, once thriving, was now drowning in debt. Meanwhile, Christopher and I grew closer. One evening, as we walked through the garden, he stopped and took my hand. "You deserve someone who values you, Kath," he said softly. "Someone who sees how incredible you are." "Like you?" I teased, though my heart raced at the look in his eyes. "Exactly like me," he said, his smile warm and genuine. Chapter 6. Christopher's presence in my life became my anchor. With every passing day, his steady support and kind words chipped away at the bitterness left by Carter's betrayal. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace in my parents' home, he opened up in a way I hadn't expected. "You know, Kath," he began, swirling his drink in his hand, "I've loved you for as long as I can remember." His confession caught me off guard. I looked at him, my heart fluttering. "Chris, You don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently, his gaze locking with mine. "I just want you to know. I never said anything because you were happy with Carter, or so I thought. But seeing him treat you like that," he broke off, clenching his jaw. "You deserve someone who worships the ground you walk on." His words brought tears to my eyes. "You've always been there for me," I said, my voice trembling. "Even when I didn't deserve it." "You've always deserved it," he said softly, brushing a tear from my cheek. Chapter 7. The transition from friendship to something more with Christopher felt as natural as breathing. Our shared laughter came easily, and our conversations stretched late into the night. One evening, he surprised me with a picnic under the stars. The night air was cool, and the sky glittered with constellations. "Remember when we used to do this as kids?" he asked, lying back on the blanket and looking up at the sky. I smiled, leaning against him. "You always brought me extra snacks, because you knew I'd eat all mine too quickly. And you always shared them with me," he replied, his voice full of warmth. As the night deepened, Christopher turned to me, his expression serious. "Kathleen, I don't just want to help you heal. I want to build something new with you. Something better." I didn't hesitate. "I want that too," I whispered, and when he kissed me, it was as though every broken piece of me started to come back together. Chapter 8. Meanwhile, Carter's downfall was swift and brutal. The whispers about his incompetence turned into full-blown rumors. Investors pulled out, suppliers demanded early payments, and the company's value plummeted. Desperate, Carter turned to Arya, but she was no longer the dutiful sister. She became increasingly demanding, pushing him to spend more on her extravagant tastes. "You promised me a better life," she hissed one evening during an argument I overheard from an old colleague. "I didn't leave my secure job for this mess." "You think I wanted this?" Carter shouted back. "Do you know how hard I've worked? This isn't my fault." But it was his fault, and everyone knew it. Chapter 9. Arya, unwilling to go down with Carter, began maneuvering to secure her position. She approached investors, trying to curry favor by blaming Carter for the company's decline. "It's a shame," she told one of them, her voice dripping with feigned regret. "He's just not the leader we thought he was. But if I were in charge, I could turn things around." Her attempts failed miserably. No one trusted her, and her reputation as Carter's mistress further damaged her credibility. Desperate, she tried to manipulate Carter further. Especially now she'd become pregnant. "If you loved me, you'd fix this," she said one evening, her tone saccharine yet sharp. "I'm doing everything I can," he barked, his frustration boiling over. But their alliance, once built on deceit and lust, was now cracking under the weight of their failures. Chapter 10. Christopher and I watched from the sidelines as Carter's life fell apart. It was poetic justice. One day, I received a call from Carter. His voice was unsteady. "Kathleen, I need to see you." "There's nothing left to say," I replied coldly. "Please," he begged. "I made a mistake. I was wrong about everything, about you, about Arya. I need you." Hearing his desperation was satisfying, but I felt no pity. "You needed me when you had me, Carter. Now, I'm happy, and you're reaping what you sowed. Goodbye." Chapter 11. Christopher proposed to me 6 months later. He took me to the garden where we'd shared so many childhood memories. "Kathleen," he began, holding my hands, "you've always been the one for me. I want to spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you've made me." Tears filled my eyes as I said yes. Our wedding was everything I'd dreamed of, simple, intimate, and filled with people who truly loved us. Carter and Arya's names were barely mentioned, though whispers of their continued misfortunes floated through the crowd. Christopher and I welcomed a beautiful daughter into our lives after 10 months. As I rocked her to sleep one evening, I thought back to the woman I used to be, naive, trusting, and willing to give everything to someone who didn't deserve it. Now, I was stronger, happier, and loved by a man who valued me beyond measure. And for that, I was endlessly grateful. You're absolutely correct. I'll revise that part and incorporate the details you previously provided about why Arya had a miscarriage. Let me expand on it accordingly. Chapter 11. Arya's life with Carter grew increasingly unstable. Their constant arguments turned into outright hostility. Arya, unable to accept the fallout of their choices, grew desperate to hold on to what little power she had over Carter. One evening, their shouting escalated dangerously. Carter, frustrated with his crumbling life, lashed out verbally, blaming her for his failures. "You're nothing but a distraction," he spat. Arya's stress compounded daily. Her health began to deteriorate, but she ignored the warning signs. Despite her pregnancy, she continued to drink at social gatherings to maintain her public image, hiding her anxiety behind forced smiles and sharp words. Her downfall came when she fainted at an event. Rushed to the hospital, the doctors revealed she had suffered a miscarriage due to severe stress and unhealthy habits. The news devastated her, but Carter's reaction was anything but supportive. "Why should I care?" he sneered. "You've already ruined everything else in my life. Why not this too?" The miscarriage was not only a physical blow, but a mental one as well. When the doctors informed her that she would likely never conceive again, it broke her spirit entirely. Arya, once the confident, manipulative woman who had helped Carter betray me, became a shadow of her former self. She remained with Carter for a short time, but their relationship disintegrated completely after her miscarriage. Left without a child or a partner who cared for her, she drifted into obscurity, living a lonely, bitter life. Carter, now abandoned and bankrupt, tried to reach out to me once more, but his words fell on deaf ears. His pleas for forgiveness were met with silence. In contrast, my life with Christopher blossomed. We welcomed a beautiful daughter into our lives, and every day felt like a new beginning. As I looked at my family, I felt nothing but gratitude for the choices I had made to walk away from Carter and his deceit. Chapter 12. As the months passed, Carter's life unraveled further. His once thriving company was no more, reduced to a shell burdened with debts. Investors had pulled out, employees had resigned, and his reputation in the business world was irreparably damaged. Carter now lived in a shabby, one-bedroom apartment, a far cry from the luxurious home he once shared with Kathleen. The furniture was second-hand, the walls peeling, and the heater often broke during the cold nights. Each morning, he dragged himself to work at a local supermarket, stacking shelves and enduring the pitying or mocking stares of former acquaintances. He couldn't escape the whispers. "Isn't that Carter, the guy who had it all?" they'd say, shaking their heads in disbelief. He overheard someone call him a fool for throwing away a good woman and a golden opportunity. Every corner of his apartment seemed to haunt him with memories of Kathleen. Her laughter, her unwavering support, and her presence that once brought light into his life were now stark reminders of what he had lost. Carter often found himself staring at the engagement ring Kathleen had thrown back at him. He hadn't pawned it, though he desperately needed the money. Instead, he kept it in a drawer, occasionally taking it out and berating himself for his foolishness. "She would have stayed," he muttered to himself, "if I'd just been smarter. If I hadn't let Arya." But the thought of Arya filled him with bitterness. The woman he had once defended so fervently now represented everything that had gone wrong. Arya's provocations didn't end after their breakup. She frequently called Carter, begging him to take her back or blaming him for her misery. "You ruined my life," she screamed during one call. "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be in this mess." Carter's patience snapped. "Your life? Your life? What about mine, Arya? You cost me Kathleen, my business, and everything I worked for." Their conversations often ended in screaming matches, with Carter slamming the phone down and sinking into his creaky chair, holding his head in his hands. Desperate and broken, Carter began showing up at Kathleen's family mansion, begging for a chance to speak with her. Each time, the guards turned him away, but he refused to give up. One rainy evening, drenched and shivering, he stood outside the gates, pleading with the guards. "Just tell her I'm here," he said, his voice hoarse. "Please, I just need a minute." From a distance, Carter saw Kathleen step out onto the balcony with Christopher by her side. The sight of them together, happy, in love, was like a dagger to his chest. When Kathleen glanced his way, her expression wasn't one of pity but of indifference. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter," the guard said, pulling him back to reality. "You're not welcome here." Carter turned away, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. As the months dragged on, Carter's desperation turned to despondency. His savings were gone, his debts mounted, and he could no longer afford even the dingy apartment. Forced to sell his last possessions, he moved into a cheap boarding house. The final blow came when he ran into an old colleague at the supermarket. The man barely recognized him at first. "Carter," he said, his tone a mix of disbelief and pity. "Yeah," Carter muttered, avoiding eye contact. The man shook his head. "You had it all, didn't you? What happened?" Carter couldn't answer. The end.